And you have U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, of course, wrapping up her trip there, her visit to China, by repeating her warning about overcapacity, especially in sectors including EVs and lithium batteries.
China is now simply too large for the rest of the world to absorb this enormous capacity. Actions taken by the PRC today can shift world prices. And when the global market is flooded by artificially cheap Chinese products, the viability of American and other foreign firms is put into question.
Well, not everyone agrees with Yellen on her concerns when it comes to China's overcapacity. Let's bring in David Fickling, our Bloomberg Opinion columnist. And he thinks her viewpoint is a, quote, protectionist disaster that could muddy the path to net zero emissions. David, please explain.
I'm slightly dreading setting myself up against Janet Yellen, but no, I mean, the point I'm making, you know, she herself, she's an eminent economist, one of the most eminent of her generation, and she made this point in an interview with the Wall Street Journal last week. She said, you know, the standard economics would say if a country can send you cheap goods, you should buy them and send them back, you know, the things that you can produce cheaply in return. That is standard economics. It's comparative advantage. It's one of the most sort of fundamental principles of trade economics for 200 years. Now, what is clearly happening at the moment is the other countries other than China are concerned at the scale and efficiency of China's clean tech sector, and they fear that is a competitive threat to their own clean tech sectors. But looking at it in terms of the pure economics, is it artificially cheap, as she was saying? I think if you look at the firm level data of individual companies, you don't see the evidence of subsidies that are getting talked about. What you see is a very large and very competitive industry, and we've seen that sort of thing, you know, ever since Henry Ford was building giant car factories in Detroit a century ago.
Right. It's also worth noting, and I want to take a bit from your column today, and if you could just elaborate on this, that so when you have a U.S. Treasury Secretary head to China or engage with China, immediately, you know, my mind goes to trade imbalances and the imbalance of the relationship. But you make a point here that the relationship between these two economies, is a lot more balanced today than it was 5, 10, 15, 20 years back, David.
Yeah, I mean, this gets lost in the debate a little bit, but the U.S. Census Bureau every month publishes figures for the bilateral trade balance between the U.S. and China. The annual figure last year was the lowest it's been in nominal dollar terms since 2010. And actually, if you measure it against the size of the U.S. economy, because of course the U.S. economy is much bigger since 2010, it's the lowest since 2002 as a share of the U.S. economy, which is just months after China joined the World Trade Organization. This, this argument about sector imbalances, and I think, you know, essentially arguments are being made about the sort of funding structure of individual Chinese companies based on sort of inference from these large sectoral imbalances, but even the imbalances are not really there.
And I mean, just given, I'm just talking about just this whole EV transition, right? And just given how dominant China already is in a lot of the supply chains revolving renewable energy, I mean, can the U.S. actually not rely on China to achieve, as you say, those net zero goals?
I think it's very notable. You know, you saw in that clip Janet Yellen talking about, like, there is, vastly more capacity than demand would suggest. But if you compare, say, planned capacity against what the International Energy Agency says is going to be necessary if we want to reach net zero by 2030, in hardly any of these sectors are you actually seeing any overcapacity. I think you probably are in cars. You're certainly not seeing it in lithium-ion batteries. I don't think you're even really seeing it in solar panels, although there is huge capacity under construction with solar panels in China. The one sector that is not heavily exposed to Chinese trade is wind equipment, which is very hard to export internationally. And in wind equipment, we are drastically behind where we need to be if we need to get to net zero. So I would go back to what Yellen said in the first place. If a country sends you stuff cheaply, you should send them a thank you note. If a country is manufacturing the capacity to get to net zero cheaply, again, you should send them a thank you note.